The morning of the Ashwick wedding was cold for late April, the kind of cold that felt like the season had not yet decided whether to relent. The great hall of Ashwick Park was already crowded at 10:30, and the candles in the high chandeliers were still burning because the gray light through the windows was not enough to flatter the room. Miss Cecily Vane stood at the edge of the receiving line in her cream muslin gown, the one she had retrimmed twice with the good ivory ribbon from her mother's old work basket, and she tried not to hear what Lady Doris Fenwick was saying behind the third pillar. She did not entirely succeed. "They say he brought her down from Shropshire," Lady Doris murmured to her companion, and the companion made a sound of sympathetic comprehension. "The family would not come, you understand. Nothing to recommend her. Quiet little thing. Plain little thing. Rather sad when one considers what Ashwick used to attract." A pause. "The Duke will not stay past the breakfast, I should think. He rarely does these days." Cecily's hands, in their white gloves, were perfectly still at her sides. She had learned this particular stillness over the past 18 months, since her father had died and the world had gently but firmly revised its opinion of what she was worth. She let the words settle where they would, and lifted her chin just slightly, enough to see across the hall to where the Duke of Carston stood near the library doors. He was not looking at her. He was standing alone, which was itself a small peculiarity, because men of Carston's rank and temperament were rarely permitted to stand alone at events like these, without someone pressing in to fill the silence. His profile was turned toward the windows. A dark blue coat, a white cravat precisely tied, the kind of stillness in a large room that came not from shyness, but from a decision made long ago to conserve what he gave the world. He was perhaps 35, though he could have passed for older in certain lights. Then he turned, and his gaze found her across the 60 feet of polished floor with the particular accuracy of a man who had already noted exactly where she was standing and had chosen this moment to acknowledge it. Cecily looked away first. What she did not yet know was that the Duke of Carston had been watching her for a quarter of an hour, and that what he had seen had already undone something he had spent 4 years carefully maintaining. The Vane family had fallen the way provincial families sometimes fell, quietly and without drama, the kind of ruin that did not make good gossip because there was no villainy in it, only arithmetic. Her father had been a gentleman of modest means and immodest generosity, and when he died of a fever, the winter before last, he left behind 3 daughters, a house in Shropshire already under mortgage, and a debt schedule that amounted to £1,600. The elder 2 sisters had been fortunate. The youngest, Cecily, who had been engaged at the time of her father's death to a perfectly suitable young man in Ludlow, found that her betrothed's father had certain views about encumbered estates and revised his son's intentions accordingly. She had not made a scene about it. She had packed a trunk and accepted the only invitation available, which was her second cousin Arabella's wedding to Mr. Gerald Thurston of Ashwick Park, and she had arrived in Wiltshire with the ivory ribbon and £32, and nothing else that the season would recognize as currency. The morning of the wedding, she dressed herself, because she could not afford a maid, and she stood at the mirror for a long moment before she went down. The gown was clean. The gloves were nearly new. Her hair was dark and simply arranged, the way she had learned to arrange it because there was no one to do it for her. She was not a handsome woman in the way the season meant, but she was not the nothing that the season had decided either. She was 22 years old, and she had a face that sometimes, in certain lights, surprised even people who had looked past it for months. She went down. The receiving line was Lady Doris Fenwick's natural habitat. and she had stationed herself there with the confidence of a woman who had been shaping the room's opinion at events like these for 30 years. She was not cruel in the cartoonish sense. She was a woman whose social authority had been a form of competence her entire life, whose categories were precise and reliable, and whose first assessment of Cecily Vane had been completed in approximately 4 seconds. Provincial, encumbered, past her best season, no connections of use, not in the running. The assessment was filed and acted upon, and Lady Doris moved on to more interesting subjects. Cecily endured it with the patience of someone who had had 18 months to understand that the world's verdict was not the only verdict available, only the loudest. She found a chair near the small fire in the east anteroom and sat down beside old Mrs. Hartwell, who was Arabella's grandmother's companion and who had been at Ashwick Park so long she no longer troubled herself with the season's opinions. Mrs. Hartwell was 81 and partially deaf, and she liked Cecily immediately, which meant she took her hand and held it without speaking. And this was the most comfortable Cecily had felt since arriving in Wiltshire. If you have ever sat beside someone who simply decided you were worth holding on to, you will understand what that particular warmth costs. It was there that the Duke of Carston found her, 20 minutes before the ceremony was due to begin. He crossed the anteroom with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had decided he was going to do something and saw no benefit in the interval between the decision and the act. He stopped beside her chair, and Mrs. Hartwell, who was not deaf enough to miss everything, looked up at him with uncomplicated interest. "Miss Vane," he said. Cecily rose, because one rose for a duke. "Your Grace." He did not fill the silence immediately, which she had not expected. Most men of his rank filled silences as a matter of habit. This one seemed to consider them an opportunity. "You are sitting away from the fire," he said at last. "Come closer." It was not a request. It had the syntax of a command and the function of something else, and Cecily was not sure which she was supposed to hear. "I am quite comfortable, Your Grace." "You are not. The fire is 4 feet to your left, and you have your hands folded as though you are trying to keep them warm." He paused, and she could hear something in his voice that she could not name, a quality of having looked at a thing until he understood it. "Sit closer to the fire, Miss Vane. Mrs. Hartwell will move with you. The chairs are not fixed." Mrs. Hartwell, who appeared to find this entirely reasonable, moved her chair. Cecily moved hers. The Duke of Carston remained standing until she was settled. And then, without further explanation, he returned to the hall. She sat beside the fire, and her hands were warmer, and she told herself she did not know what to make of it, which was only partly true. Her body had understood something in those 3 minutes that her mind was not yet ready to permit. There was a warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the great. The wedding ceremony was brief and genuinely affecting. Arabella was a girl of 19 who had married for love, which was either very brave or very fortunate depending on one's circumstances, and she held Mr. Thurston's hand through the entire service with the absolute conviction of someone who did not yet know what the world might ask her to give up. Cecily sat in the 3rd pew and watched and kept her face composed. The Duke of Carston was seated across the aisle and 5 rows forward. She was careful not to look at him more than twice. She succeeded in limiting herself to 4 times. The wedding breakfast was laid in the great dining room with a table that seated 42, and Cecily found herself placed near the lower end, between the vicar's wife and a young man from Dorset, who spent the entire meal discussing his estate improvements with the vicar's wife, and seemed unaware that Cecily existed. This was not unusual. She ate her soup and her fish course, and listened to the room's general noise, and tried not to feel the distance between where she sat and where the Carston party was assembled at the upper end. She had been told, by the woman who organized the seating, that the placement was not personal. She had accepted this with a nod that she hoped communicated polite comprehension, and nothing else. Lady Doris Fenwick, who was seated 4 chairs above her and across, said something to the woman beside her that produced a brief glance in Cecily's direction and a small sound of amusement. Cecily did not hear the words this time. She did not need to. She recognized the register. She reached for her water glass with a perfectly steady hand. From the upper end of the table, in the momentary silence that sometimes fell over a long meal between the fish course and the meat, she heard the Duke of Carston speak. His voice carried without elevation, the way voices did when they were accustomed to being listened to. "I visited Shropshire some years ago," he said, to no one in particular, and perhaps to the table at large. "The country around the Stretton Hills is finer than most people credit it with being." A pause. One tends not to hear it praised sufficiently. There was a brief, polite agreement from several directions, and the conversation moved on, and Cecily's hand was not entirely steady on the water glass now, and she set it down carefully. And she looked at the tablecloth for a long moment before she could compose her face to something neutral. He had named her County, in passing, in a way that could not be followed, could not be argued with, could not be collected and used. She did not know whether he had done it for her. She suspected, with a certainty she could not fully account for, that he had. She had come to Ashwick Park with no expectations, and the thing that was happening to them now was inconvenient in the extreme. After the breakfast, the guests moved to the garden, where the lawn was wide, and the afternoon had turned mild enough to permit it. And there were chairs arranged under the oak trees and trays of champagne being carried about. Cecily walked to the far edge of the lawn, where a low stone wall separated the garden from the home wood, and she stood there in the pale April sun and let herself simply exist for a moment, without managing anything. She heard a footstep behind her and did not turn immediately, because the footstep had a particular weight. "You prefer the edge of things," the Duke of Carston said. "It is quieter." She turned. He was closer than she had expected, perhaps 6 feet. And the light here was different, softer. And she could see the small tension at the corner of his jaw that was not quite an expression. "Yes," he said. "I have noticed that about you." "I did not realize you had been noticing anything about me, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen with a degree of specificity that she had not been seen with in a very long time. "You were the only person in that dining room," he said at last, "who held your composure through the second course when Lady Fenwick spoke. You did not flinch, and you did not redden, and you did not look down. You reached for your water glass." Cecily was silent. "I thought," he said, "that was worth noticing." She looked at him carefully. She was not a woman who permitted herself the easy pleasure of believing what she wished to believe. She had been trained out of it by experience, and the training had been thorough. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I am a woman with no portion and no connections, and nothing the season considers worth the attention of a man in your position. I am aware of what I am and what I am not. You need not be kind to me." "I am not being kind," he said. "I am being accurate." He paused. "They are not the same thing." He left before she could answer. She stood at the stone wall for a moment longer after his footsteps had receded across the grass. The oak trees at the edge of the home wood were not yet fully leafed, and the light came through them in the particular filtered way it did in late April, when everything was still in the first tender stage of becoming. She was aware that her hands were no longer cold, and that the cause of this was not the sun. She pressed her palms together inside their gloves and breathed out slowly. It would have been simpler if he had been careless about it, the way men of his rank occasionally were, distributing attention the way one distributed coins at a Michaelmas fair, casually and with no particular investment in where they landed. She would have known how to manage that. She had managed the end of her engagement, the loss of the house, the revision of the world's opinion of her worth. And she had done it by becoming very precise about what was real and what was wished for. She was not, she told herself, a woman who mistook charity for attention. But he had said he was not being kind. He had said he was being accurate. And accuracy was something she understood. That night she lay awake in the small room she had been given at the back of the house, and she listened to the last of the wedding guests departing on the gravel drive below. And she told herself very firmly not to make anything of what had happened. A man of Karsten's rank had spoken to her twice. He had named her county. He had watched her hold her composure. These were not the transactions of a man whose intentions were serious. They were the small mercies that men of rank sometimes dispensed without intention, like coins dropped into a passing hand. She believed this approximately halfway. The following morning she was in the Ashwick Park Library before anyone else was awake, because she could not sleep, and because libraries had always been the one place she could exist without having to manage herself quite so carefully. She was standing at the shelves that held the natural histories, which were her particular love, when the door opened. The Duke of Karsten stopped on the threshold. He was not dressed for morning calls, which meant he had come down early as well, which meant he also had not slept well. And she watched this calculation move across his face, and then settle into something that was not quite composure. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace." She held the book she had taken from the shelf in both hands, not quite clutching it. "I will go." "You will not." He came into the room, and the door did not close entirely behind him, and the fire had been lit but was still new, the room still carrying the cold of the night. "What are you reading?" She showed him the spine. A Natural History of the British Isles, 1799. He took the chair nearest the fire without asking permission, and said, "There is a passage on the Stretton Hills in Chapter 17. The author is wrong about the limestone formations, but the description of the light is accurate." She stood there for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair on the other side of the fire, the book open in her lap, and he said nothing more for several minutes. And she read. And the fire came up, and the light through the windows slowly turned from gray to pale gold. It was the most comfortable she had been in 2 years. She read 3 pages of Chapter 4 before she noticed that she was not absorbing the sentences in sequence, that her mind kept returning to the quality of the silence in the room, which was different from other silences she had sat inside. Most silences of this kind carried obligation, the obligation to fill them or to manage the other person's comfort inside them. This one did not. It was a silence that seemed to have agreed with itself about its own terms and required nothing from her but her presence. She looked up once. He was reading something from a fold of papers he had taken from his coat, and he did not look up. But the slight adjustment of his posture as she moved suggested that he was aware of her, the way one was aware of a fire in a room without constantly looking at it. She went back to her book. Later, when she thought about this morning, she understood that it was where something shifted that had not been able to shift before, where 2 people who had both learned to be careful found, without planning it, that they had been less careful with each other than with anyone else. The fire had come fully up now, and the room had its morning warmth, and outside the Wiltshire landscape was doing what it did in late April, presenting itself in gradations of new green that the season would complicate before it was done. She had set aside the natural history and taken up a volume of essays she had found on the lower shelf, and she was not entirely reading it either. She was aware, in the specific way she had been aware since the garden, of the fact that the room contained two people who were each behaving as though they were alone. She understood this as a form of mutual courtesy. She also understood that it was not quite the same as actually being alone. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said abruptly into the quiet, and she looked up. He was looking at the fire. "She was ill for 2 years before it. I was in London for much of that time on family business that I have since decided was not important enough. I was not there when she died." He paused. "I was told this later by my housekeeper, who meant it kindly, but the kindness did not help." His jaw was set. "I have not found a great deal of use for my presence at events like these in the years since, but I came for Thurston's sake." Cecily sat very still. "I have told you this," he said, "because you did not tell me that I need not be accurate about you. You told me I need not be kind, and I thought accuracy deserved the same." She looked at him for a long time in the quiet morning room. "Your Grace," she said at last, "I am sorry for what you lost." "Yes," he said simply. "I know you are." She did not ask how he knew. She understood that he was a man who had become very good at reading what was genuine, the way people sometimes did after they had been given enough occasions to distinguish it from what was merely polite. The book in her lap had a pressed violet between pages 42 and 43. It had been there when she took it from the shelf, left by some previous reader in some previous season, and she did not know whose it had been or how long it had been keeping that place. She looked at it for a moment, then closed the book gently, the violet still inside, and set it on the side table. She would remember that violet. What followed across the next 3 days was not a courtship in the way the season meant. There were no formal calls, no deliberate promenades, no careful third-party negotiations. There was the library in the morning, twice more, once with rain on the windows, and once with thin late April sun. There was a walk across the Ashwick Park grounds on the second afternoon, where they found themselves slightly ahead of the party without having arranged it. There was a conversation after dinner on the second evening that lasted longer than was entirely usual in the drawing room, with Mrs. Hartwell asleep in her chair nearby and the fire burning down. He asked her about natural history. She told him about the Stretton Hills with the specificity of someone who had loved a place well. He listened with the quality of attention that she had begun to understand was not his public face, but something underneath it, quieter and more careful. She asked him about his son, whose name she had heard mentioned once in passing. His name was George, and he was 7 years old, and he lived at Carston Hall in Derbyshire with his governess, and a great many books and a stubborn disinterest in eating his breakfast. The Duke said this last part with something in his voice that was almost, in a different register, affection. Cecily watched the corner of his mouth and said nothing, because it was not the moment for speech. And he looked away. It was on the third day that Lady Doris Fenwick decided the situation had become interesting. She said it in the morning room to 3 other women, and within earshot of Arabella's mother, whose discretion was not equal to her goodwill. "One does wonder what the Duke of Carston finds so absorbing about the little vain creature. She has nothing to offer him. Nothing." She touched her fan lightly to her own wrist. "I imagine it is simple gallantry on his part. He was always given to odd mercies. She should not mistake charity for attention. It would be unkind to let her continue to." The words reached Cecily by way of the housemaid, who brought her tea at noon, and who was young and not yet practiced in the art of withholding. Cecily thanked the girl and sat down on the edge of her bed, and thought about the pressed violet. She had been here before. Not in this specific geometry, but in the essential shape of a man's attention, and the world's measured explanation of why it could not mean what it appeared to mean. She knew how this reasoning ran. She knew it had been right before. She went down to luncheon. The Duke of Karsten was seated across the table, and he looked at her once when she sat down, a direct, level look, and then looked away. She looked at her plate. The meal went on. The room's conversation ran its usual patterns around them. She had, she reflected, become moderately expert at the particular art of sitting in a room that was deciding not to include her. It was a skill acquired under duress, like most useful skills, and it was not one she would have chosen. It meant she could follow the thread of a conversation across 20 feet of dining room and understand its purpose without needing to hear the specific words. She could track the slight redirection of a gaze, the small adjustive smile, the quality of a laugh that was designed to carry. The table had been given a new set of instructions about her between the soup and the fish courses. She had watched it happen. She ate her fish, and watched the light shift and thought about the library that morning and the particular quality of the silence they had sat inside, and she held the thought carefully, the way one held something fragile. Afterward, Lady Doris appeared at Cecily's elbow with the smooth confidence of a woman executing a plan she had not needed to revise in 30 years. "My dear Miss Vane," she said warmly, "I wonder if I might have a word. A friendly word." She steered Cecily to the window bay with a hand at her arm that felt like the lightest possible grip. "I hope you will take this in the spirit in which it is intended. The Duke of Karsten is a particular man. He has been since his wife died, as I am sure you know. He is very good to people he feels deserve his attention. But I hope you will forgive me for saying that his charity ought not to be mistaken for intention. He has a son to think of. His family, I know for a fact, has particular expectations. You understand?" Cecily looked at her for a moment. "I understand you perfectly," she said. "Thank you, Lady Doris." It was not possible to tell from her tone which of the possible meanings of those words she had intended. Lady Doris chose the convenient one and moved away, satisfied. Cecily stood at the window. The garden was pale and still outside the glass. A gardener was working at the far edge of the lawn, doing something to the rose beds that involved a great deal of patience and a small-handled tool, and she watched him for a moment, because it was easier to watch him than to look at her own reflection in the glass. She had been here before. Not in this exact drawing room. Not with this specific man's name in the argument, but in the essential shape of it. A woman with experience and authority arriving to explain that the thing you had permitted yourself to begin to hope was not the thing it appeared to be, and that the explanation was for your own good, and that you should understand this as a kindness. She had found, the first time, that believing it had been a kindness. It had been clean, like a cold room after too much warmth. She had packed her trunk, and she had not cried until she was on the road and could not be seen. She thought about the library this morning. She thought about him saying he was certain of something and naming what the something was, with the particular quality of directness she had understood from the first day as being not his performance, but his nature. She thought about her own hands on the book, and how they had not been steady, and how she had not managed to make them steady. She thought about the ivory ribbon on her retrimmed gown, and about what it meant to be 22 years old, and to have been sorted into the category of things the world did not need to account for. And she thought about whether the Duke of Karsten's opinion of that category coincided with the world's. She thought he had already told her, twice, that it did not. She thought about going upstairs. She stayed where she was. The Duke of Carston appeared in the doorway. He had not been in the room a moment ago. She did not know how long he had been standing there. "She is not wrong," Cecily said, without turning, because she thought if she turned, she would not be able to keep her voice as steady as she needed it to be. "She is entirely wrong." His voice was quiet. He crossed the room until he was standing beside her, 6 feet, then 4, and she kept looking at the garden. "She has confused her understanding of my position with her understanding of what I want, and they are not the same thing." A pause. "They have not been the same thing for 3 days." "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was very careful, "I will not mistake what I want to hear for what you mean. I have been through that mistake once, and it was expensive." "I know." He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool room. "I'm telling you what I mean. I want you to hear it precisely, so that there is no room for a misunderstanding in either direction." A pause. "I have not wanted to sit in a room with someone for 3 days without it costing me something significant in 4 years. I do not know what to do with that yet. I know what it is." She turned. He was looking at her with the particular attention she had seen in the anteroom on the first morning, the quality of having looked at a thing until he understood it, and she understood that this was his version of everything she had been trying not to feel for 3 days, laid out with the accuracy he had promised her in the garden. "I have a son," he said, "who needs someone to sit in a library in the morning. And I have a life that has been mostly a discipline for 4 years, and I would like to know if it is possible for it to be something else." He paused. "I'm not certain of a great deal at this moment. I'm certain of that." She looked at him for a long time. "I would like to know too," she said quietly. He reached out and his hand found hers, where it rested at her side, gloved, and he held it, and neither of them moved for a moment. And outside the window, the April light was thin and pale, and entirely sufficient. She was still not making promises, and neither was he, and it was exactly right. The matter came to its necessary public shape 2 days later at the final evening gathering before the Ashwick Park party broke up, a dinner of 22 at the long table with candles and the late spring cold still at the windows. Cecily was seated near the lower end again. The Duke of Carston was at the upper end. These were the facts. Lady Doris Fenwick was seated between Lord Weston and Mr. Fenwick Aldgate, and she had spent the first 2 courses consolidating the room's understanding of what the past several days had and had not signified. She was not crude about it. She was a woman of experience, and she spoke in qualified suggestions that left the room free to draw its own conclusions, which were the conclusions she intended. By the fish course, 3 women near Cecily had let their eyes slide over her in a particular way, the way that meant the room had been given a new instruction about what to see when it looked in her direction. Cecily sat through it with the stillness she had learned. The 4th voicing happened near the end of the 2nd course, when Lady Doris's voice carried in one of those accidental silences that fell over long dinner tables. "She is a sweet girl, I have no doubt," Lady Doris said pleasantly to Lord Weston, "but really rather invisible. The kind one quite forgets is there." The room absorbed this. Several people did not. The Duke of Carston set down his fork. The sound of it was not loud. It was precise. The table, which had been attending to its general business, found its attention reoriented in the way that attention was reoriented in rooms where a man of his rank made a small, deliberate move. He rose. He did not make a speech. He did not address Lady Doris. He crossed the length of the dining room with the unhurried, deliberate stride Cecily recognized from the morning in the anteroom, and he stopped beside her chair and 42 eyes were on him without a single person having planned to look. He said in a voice that carried without effort, "Miss Vane, will you do me the honor of accepting my particular attention for the remainder of the season?" The phrasing was formal. It was also, in the language the room spoke, entirely unambiguous. It was not charity. It was not gallantry. It was a declaration in the grammar the season used, delivered in the room where the season's verdict had been rendered, with the room's original verdict still hanging in the air from 4 seconds ago. Cecily looked up at him. She had thought, when she imagined this moment in its impossible form, that she would feel triumph. She did not. She felt something quieter and much more serious, the feeling of a thing she had stopped expecting being given back to her, in full, in front of exactly the people who had taken it. "I would be very glad to, Your Grace," she said. He bowed. Not the small nod of social acknowledgement, a full bow, deliberate and unhurried, the bow one made to a woman whose worth was not in question. The room was very still. Lady Doris Fenwick's fan had stopped moving. The rival she had positioned, a young woman in jonquil satin near the upper end, had gone slightly pale. Lord Weston was examining the middle distance with great care. Several of the women who had let their eyes slide past Cecily 2 courses ago were now looking at her with a different quality of attention entirely. The Duke of Carston straightened and offered his hand, and Cecily took it. And he waited while she rose. And then he said, very quietly, just for her, "You are not invisible." "No," she said. "I know." He seated her nearer the fire. The dinner concluded. The world went on. Lady Doris recovered herself with the professionalism of a woman who had been corrected before, and she found the recovery path available to her, which was to have been speaking of someone else entirely, and to have been entirely misunderstood. Several people accepted this without difficulty. Several did not. In the morning, the room's understanding of Cecily Vane had undergone the kind of revision that proceeded quietly and entirely, and did not advertise itself, but was thorough. Arabella Thurston caught Cecily's arm in the entrance hall after dinner and held it for a moment without speaking, and her face said everything she could not find words for. And Cecily pressed her hand and smiled and said good night. If you have been told for long enough that you are forgettable, there is a particular interior rearrangement required when someone refuses to forget you. It does not happen in a moment. It settles in over hours, over the slow evidence of actions rather than words. Cecily sat by the window in her small room that night and let it settle, and the April stars were out, which was unusual for England, and particularly welcome. The pressed violet was in her pocket. She had taken it from the book when no one was watching. She was not quite sure why. She only knew it felt like something she should not leave behind. The summer unfolded as summers do in England, with more interruption than warmth and more beauty than either, and it unfolded for Cecily in a way that was altogether different from any summer she had navigated before. There were visits to Carston Hall in Derbyshire, which was a large grey house at the edge of a valley with a library that contained 4,000 volumes and a 7-year-old boy who looked at her from a doorway for 3 days before he consented to come in and sit beside her while she read. His name was George, and he had his father's quality of stillness and his own quality of solemnity, and he had been lonely for a long time in the way that children were lonely when the adults around them were performing a grief they did not understand. He asked her about the Stretton Hills on the 5th day, because his father had mentioned them, and she described them until he closed his eyes and said he could see them. And she watched his face in the firelight and felt something open in her chest that had been carefully shut for 2 years. She told the Duke of Carston about it that evening, in the library, which had become their library in the quiet way that things became theirs over those months. He was standing at the window when she finished speaking, and she watched the line of his shoulders change. Some held tension releasing. And he turned, and there was something in his face she had not seen before. Some thawing of the last careful reserve. "He has not slept easily since his mother died," he said. "I know." She had understood this on the second day. He needs someone to tell him that the world continues to be the kind of place that contains the Stretton Hills. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He does." There was a portrait on the wall of the study, a woman with light hair and a quiet expression, and he had not spoken of it, and she had not asked, because she understood that some things needed the time they needed, and not a moment less. She had waited, and the waiting had been correct. The summer had its particular progress. She learned the hall as halls were learned, by the incremental accumulation of small specific knowledges. Which corridor was cold in the morning? Which window gave the best light for reading? Where George kept the book he was currently most invested in, and did not wish his governess to find. She learned the rhythms of the Duke's mornings, which were early, and his evenings, which were long, and the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking, versus when he was not. She learned that he watched her read sometimes, with an expression that was not quite readable, and that she had decided not to inquire about, because she suspected the inquiry would cost both of them something they were not entirely ready to spend. On an evening in late August, she was in the library, and he came in, and she put down her book, and he stood for a moment near the door, and then came and sat in his usual chair, and neither of them spoke for a while. The windows were open, and the Derbyshire evening came in carrying the smell of the hills, which was different from Shropshire in specific ways she could enumerate if asked. And she was thinking about this small, pleasant peculiarity of comparison when he said, without preamble, "You belong here." She looked up. His face was turned toward the window. "Not in the way of a guest who has been made comfortable," he said. "In the way of a person who was always the thing this room was missing, and neither the room nor the person knew it until now." He paused. "I have thought about how to say that with more precision, and I have not managed it." She did not speak immediately. She let the sentence settle. "I think," she said at last, "that is quite precise enough." He turned from the window. His eyes met hers, with the quality of directness she had learned to trust over these months. The particular attention that she understood now was not his public face, but the one underneath it, offered only in rooms that contained them both without an audience. They sat for a long time in the warm, late summer quiet. In September, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the library. Where else, with the early autumn rain on the windows, and George asleep upstairs, and he did not make a speech. He said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life being accurate with you, if you are willing." And she had not answered for a moment because the words had landed somewhere under her composure, and she needed a moment to recover it. "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest, most complete thing she had said in 2 years. He took her hands, both of them, and held them, and outside the autumn rain ran down the Derbyshire hills, and inside the fire was bright, and the library was quiet, and the portrait on the study wall was what it was, a grief that had been real and that had ended. That did not prevent what was happening here from being real and from continuing. They were married in October, quietly, at the parish church in the village nearest the hall, with George standing beside his father in a small dark coat, and Mrs. Hartwell, who had been invited because Cecily had asked for her, and the Duke had arranged the carriage without comment, seated in the front pew with the uncomplicated attention of a woman who had been at enough events to know the genuine ones on sight. Arabella Thurston was there. She cried, which she had warned Cecily she would do, and she had been right. The morning after the wedding, Cecily woke before dawn in the room that was hers now, the room with the high windows and the view of the valley, and she lay still for a moment and listened to the house settle around her, the particular sound of a large house in the early morning when it is occupied rather than maintained, when there are people in it who belong there. She rose and went to the window. The valley was dark and the stars were out again, as they had been in April, which felt like a circle closed or perhaps a line extended forward. She was not quite sure which, and did not need to be. She heard the door and turned. George was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, solemn-eyed, holding something. It was a book. The Natural History of the British Isles, 1799. He had found it somewhere in the hall's 4,000 volumes and brought it to her without explanation. "Papa said you like this one," he said. She looked at the book and then at this small, careful boy in the doorway, and she felt the full weight of the world being comprehensible again, being the kind of place where quiet acts of dignity produced quiet acts of recognition, where a man had looked across a crowded hall and seen what was actually there, where a child had woken before dawn to bring a book. "I do," she said. "Come in." He came in and she lit the lamp, and they sat together at the window seat, while the valley outside went slowly from dark to gray to the thin particular gold of an October morning in Derbyshire, and she opened the book to chapter 17, which was about the limestone formations of the Stretton Hills and the quality of the light in the late afternoon, and she began to read. The pressed violet was still between pages 42 and 43. She had put it back. "Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, leave a word in the comments, and the next chapter is already waiting."